What's up guys, welcome back to DCS World and my tutorial series for the A-10C. Today we're going to take a look at the targeting pod. So the A-10C's, one of its most useful sensors is its targeting pod. It is a wing mounted pod. You can actually see it on my wing over here. And out of interest, let me bring up the armament screen. We can load it here. It is the AN-AAQ-28 LITENING pod. Similar pod that is also found on the Harrier and now on the Hornet. And we have it here. It can go on either pylon 11 or you can load it on pylon number 2. Alright, since we've already got it up, we're not going to load it again, so there. And now we need to actually get in the air and take a look at it. So let's get airborne and I'll talk to you guys in just a few minutes. Alright, so we're in the air now. We're currently orbiting around a target range that I have set up on the beautiful palm looking area here on the Persian Gulf, just because why not? It's always fun to blow up stuff that looks cool. Anyway, enough about that. Let's talk about the targeting pod. So, most commonly you'll have the targeting pod screen up on your right hand side MFD. So in order to do that, we can either click the TGP button or we can use our coolie switch. And I'm going to warn you now, I hope you have watched my videos on HOTAS commands and on sensor of interest and sensor point of interest, because we're going to start applying those concepts right now. So we can use coolie switch right short 1 2. We are now on the TGP screen. Now when you first load it up, you'll notice that it says TGP off, okay? The TGP by default is not turned on. And if you're looking at it, it just looks like a little bulbous looking thing on the wing there. There's no what look like camera lenses normally. We need to go over to our armaments panel and we need to find our TGP switch, which is this one here. We need to right click and flip it on. That's going to power on the TGP. Now you're going to look at the TGP screen on the MFD and you're going to see not timed out. The reason we see this is because when the TGP is first powered on, it needs time to essentially warm up. In reality, it needs time to cool down because while it sits there not powered on, it actually gets very hot. So it needs to cool itself down so that it can actually run, and also boot itself up because it's essentially a flying targeting computer. So it's going to do that. You're going to see some stuff pop on the screen here. It's going to look like a boot up screen. You're going to see some information. None of that really matters too much. You'll see FLIR hot because the FLIR camera has to cool itself down. There's the boot up screen. But while it's doing that, I'm just going to skip forward a little bit. So I'll see you in a minute when the boot up process for the TGP is complete. Alright, so our TGP is booted. We can know that it is booted because the words not timed out have disappeared and we're looking at a black screen. So let me just zoom in and pause the camera. Click. Alright, so what we have here are a couple of functions. The pod is currently in what's called standby mode. You'll know it says STBY standby here. That corresponds to this center button. The buttons are a little offset from the camera angle. The pod has two modes, air to ground and air to air. We're going to first look at air to ground because that's what you're going to commonly use the targeting pod for. You're going to use it for air-to-ground functions. So to get it into air-to-ground mode, we just click the button labeled A-G. And look at that, our targeting pod is online. It is currently bore-sighted to our aircraft. I'm just going to turn my camera back on here. It is currently bore-sighted to our aircraft, which means that it is pointing roughly in the direction of our nose right now. And if we look over at the targeting pod, we can see the camera lenses have popped into view. So our targeting pod is on, and it is in a mode. So, in order to control the targeting pod, we need to make it our sensor of interest, or SOI. How do we do that? Since it's on our right side MFD, we're going to go coolie switch right long command. So that's coolie right long, hold, and if we look, pause the camera, our TGP is now our sensor of interest. It is now our SOI. We know it is SOI because we have the green box around the window, and the words not SOI have disappeared. Now, because it is our SOI, we can use our Slew Control, remember the Slew Control now, to move it around. Okay, we're looking at water right now, so it's a little hard to see it moving, but you can see the stabilization box moving. It is definitely moving around. We are moving this camera around, and in fact, if I unpause the camera and look over here and slew it around, you can actually see the targeting pod moving on my wing. See that? I'm just kind of going back and forth here a little bit, up and down. Pretty neat, huh? Let's pause the camera here again. So we can move the camera around with our Slew Control. We've got a little bit of symbology here. We have obviously our crosshairs. We have sort of a target box. We have a number down here. This indicates our slant range to whatever we're looking at in miles. So slant range is if you drew a straight line from the targeting pod's camera to whatever the targeting pod is looking at. That range in miles is our distance to that target. So I'm kind of looking down at the ground about 2 miles over there. You might also notice this little floating dot over here. This little floating dot is a reference point that tells us sort of where the targeting pod is looking in relation to where our aircraft is also looking. So notice that as I move the targeting pod left and right here, the dot sort of moves left and right. You can see some of the ground over here coming in. This dot moves left and right, and this is an indication that our targeting pod is looking, at least in this case, the dot is off to the right a little bit. That means our targeting pod is looking off to the left. The dot can be thought of roughly as an indication sort of where the nose is pointed. However, it's more indicative of the direction the aircraft is currently traveling in relation to where the targeting pod is looking. So we're looking at some of the buildings over here now. This can get below you. Okay, so let me see if I can get this to work here. That dot can go below the box. What that then tells us is that the targeting pod is looking behind us. So the targeting pod can actually look behind us a little bit as well as in front of us. Just know that it's sort of a reference point as to the targeting pod is looking in front of you or behind you. And that's really all that does there. You might also notice this here 20M. This is saying here 2022, it's in meters. And what that is a reference of scaling. So you notice the crosshair lines here. We got a white line, white line, white line, white line. Based on our current view, that white line, one of these white lines, specifically this one, and I'm actually occluding the TGP here real quick. Let me just, there we go. Let's look it out over here. All right. That white line on the ground is a real distance of 55 meters. Okay, so from here to here on the ground is 55 meters. If I zoom the TGP out and look closer here, closer down to the ground here, we see that's going down because our distance to this point that we're looking at is lower. Therefore, this line represents a shorter distance. It's sort of showing the scale. So you see as we move towards this point, this number's going down. So right now, this line represents 23 meters. Probably around, it's probably not going to get any lower than that because we're up at about 10,000 feet or so. But that's telling you how long this line is if you were to actually plot that distance on the ground. And this line, this number gets bigger as you look further away because in relation to the ground, based on your distance, like in fact I'm looking out about 10 miles now, and this is in meters, you know, that one there is about 100 meters. I keep looking further out, 200 meters. And kind of out to infinity. I'm occluding the pod now, but right about there, 50 meters, etc. That's the distance that that line represents at that exact spot on the ground. All right, let me just rebore sight this thing. And by the way, if you've been moving your targeting pod around like I have been here, if we want to reset the targeting pod's viewpoint to the aircraft's bore sight, that is, make it look straight ahead once again, you're going to use the China hat. And it's going to be a China hat aft short. So a quick click of China hat aft like this. Click. The targeting pod is going to snap back to bore sight. Now the next thing I want to show you is some HUD symbology relating to the targeting pod. So let me center my TGP, center my track IR. Let's look forward at the HUD here and pause the camera. You notice this little diamond guy right here? That is an indication of the HUD as to where our targeting pod is actually looking. It's very useful because you can sort of use your eyes looking forward to get a rough idea of where you need to place your targeting pod if you're not sure where a potential target is. So if I start slewing the targeting pod around, you can see that diamond is moving. Okay? Move it left, move it right. If I stop slewing it, it's going to stick at that point on the ground. It's called ground stabilize. It's going to stabilize itself on the ground and it's going to follow the ground where I've last left it. But then I can continue slewing it around. I can look at that island there. You see that diamond pointing where the targeting pod is looking. And if I unpause my camera and look, we saw I moved that diamond over that little island. And if we look at the targeting pod, we're looking at that little island over there. So it's an easy way to tell visually with your eyes, so long as you're sort of flying towards what you want to look at, where the targeting pod is pointing. Because to be quite honest, the targeting pod's viewport and its FOV is not very wide. It does not have a very wide field of view. It's almost like looking through a soda straw. It can get somewhat difficult to find targets if you have no rough idea of where they are with the targeting pod just by slewing it around. So something to bear in mind if you sort of lose your bearing of where your targets are, but you have a rough visual idea of where they are, put your nose on the aircraft with your bore-sighted targeting pod and then slew the targeting pod's diamond on the HUD around until it's roughly over where you think the targets are, and then go from there. Another thing we can do is we can slave the targeting pod to our current SPI. If you remember from my SOI and SPI videos, there's a function in this airplane known as slave all sensors to SPI. Conveniently, I have a waypoint set up located somewhere over here where I've got some targets set up on these little branches of the palm here. And that's actually my current waypoint. You see waypoint 1, mission 001 there. The way we slave our sensors to SPI is with China hat forward long command. So if I first let me bore sight the targeting pod, so now it's looking ahead again, we've got our diamond here. If I do slave sensors to SPI with China hat forward long, the targeting pod has now snapped. Let me pause the camera. Has now snapped over to a couple of vehicles that I have set up as one of my waypoints. Okay? this is looking at waypoint 1. That vehicle right there literally is waypoint 1 as I had it set up before I took off. And that's an easy way, such as if you have, let's say, some pre-brief data for your mission in your mission briefing that says you've got targets roughly in or around waypoint 1 or waypoint 2. You can use waypoint 1 and waypoint 2 as a reference, slave your targeting pod to those waypoints, and then you'll have a much easier time locating your targets. I can tell you right now, if I didn't know these targets were here, I mean, I did because I set this mission up more or less, but if I didn't know these targets were here, I'd have a pretty hard time actually finding them without some of that pre-briefed information. So a typical mission will give you this. If you're sort of just doing this on your own, it's going to be a little bit difficult. So, and it's also not really a realistic scenario. If you're going to fly around with a targeting pod in an A-10, you're going to have some predetermined intelligence as to where the targets are and where to place your targeting pods to find them accurately. So just bear that in mind, that you're going to use some other aids, either visual aids or waypoint aids or things of that nature, to get your targeting pod where it needs to be looking to accurately pinpoint where the targets are. Now that we've found some targets, let's actually do some things that we would normally do to get these targets locked up and pass their data onto our weapons if we had any weapons. All right, so let me zoom in on the targeting pod here. We're at about 10,000 feet orbiting around. Just want to point out some of the symbology, additional symbology on the targeting pod. If we look in the upper right corner here, we have the master mode that the targeting pod video sensor is in. It's currently in CCD mode, or charge coupled device, also known as TV mode. This is essentially just a black and white camera. It can be switched into infrared or FLIR mode, forward-looking infrared. And we do that by using the HOTAS boat switch. So by default, the boat switch is in the center position. Center position would be CCD mode. If I go boat switch aft, like this, we are now in white-hot FLIR mode, meaning targets, ignore the fact that there's just water around this little island here that's very bright, but there are targets in the middle here that are showing up as white heat signatures. If we go boat switch forward, it's the inverse. We are now in black hot FLIR mode, so the hot targets, the hot infrared signatures of those vehicles, are showing up as black specks on a white cool background. And if we wanted to go back to TV camera mode or CCD mode, we go boat switch center, and we are back in CCD mode. A little more symbology I want to point out here. 10,790, that's your current altitude. It tells you the altitude of your airplane. You've got a sort of 3D compass here that tells you where north is. So north is roughly in that direction. This is kind of a 3D N. Think like the Nintendo 64 logo. That's sort of what it looks like, actually. But the arrow is pointing north. M4, don't worry about. It has to do with the gain levels. INRA, that's our tracking mode. We are actually in an area track mode, and I'll show you how to change that in a minute. We also have, somewhat importantly, very importantly here, are the exact target coordinates of where we're looking. So where these crosshairs are, and I'm actually going to put this into black hot mode just because it's a little easier to see, but you'll just have to bear with the bright white of the water blinding you. We have the target coordinates. So where these crosshairs are looking, these are the coordinates. So we have north and east for latitude, longitude. And we can actually pass this data on to other airplanes if we were using our targeting pod, for example, to spot targets for another airplane. And that's actually a pretty useful feature because one of the roles that the A-10 played in a lot of combat scenarios was that of FAC-A, or Forward Air Control Airborne, and its primary job would be to spot targets for other airplanes, and it would pass that target data along by saying, hey, the target's here at these exact coordinates, go blow it up. Okay. A couple other functions of the TGP, we can change its zoom levels. So as you notice, I can zoom in and out, and the way I do that is with the data management switch, DMS. I go DMS forward and aft. Forward obviously zooms in, aft zooms out. All right. If I were to use the China hat forward short command, you can see I zoomed way the hell in there. China hat forward short, look up in our upper left corner of the screen, we have narrow. If I do China hat forward short, it switches to wide. This is changing the master FOV of the targeting pod, the master field of view. So you can zoom in and out in wide mode. We can only go so far, like I can get here. If I go out, zoom all the way out in wide mode, and then click China hat forward short, I'm now in narrow FOV mode, and I can zoom all the way in. I can get some really good detail. Let me slew it over this target here. I can get some really good detail on what I'm looking at. So you can see the tires. I'm gonna put it in CCD mode. You can really see, like, you can see the tires, you can see the antennas. The targeting pod can really zoom in pretty far. So it's pretty cool, right? Now, some of the other functions of the targeting pod, I'm going to put it back into FLIR mode. It just seems to work best here, and zoom out just a little bit. We can do what's called track. Now, there are two main tracking modes. There is area track mode, and there is point track mode. The way we switch between them is by clicking TMS up short. So now I am in point track mode with INRP. And I would actually need to maneuver my aircraft a little bit because there's slight occlusion. But normally we would see a point track pop up. It would say point. And there would be a little box around this target. Let me see if I can get it to pop up here for a second. All right, there we go. I just had to get a little bit more altitude. You do have to be careful of the angles at which you use the targeting pod. Sometimes the point track won't actually kick in, but now you can see I have a target box around this thing and it's adjusting itself as the target's aspect changes, but this now is in a point track. What if I wanted to track the ground in between these things? Well, what I would do is I would go TMS forward short, and now I'm in area track mode, and you can actually see area track is popping up. I'm now tracking the ground in between these targets. Area track meaning you're tracking an area, point track meaning you're tracking a point, and point track can be as accurate. If I zoom way in here, I've got a point track on that spot. Put it in a CCD mode. I've got a point track on that spot. I've got a point track on his tire, basically. You can get really, really accurate with point tracks. Let me zoom back out a little bit. FLIR mode. And I'm occluding it slightly. But you can see how point track works. It'll track vehicles. Point track will track moving targets. So when you acquire something in a point track, it will move with the moving target. So if these vehicles were moving, the TGP would stay locked onto them. And that's important because we then want to be able to employ our laser target designator. The targeting pod has an onboard laser pointer. And how that works, I'm going to go more detail into when we explore laser-guided bombs, but I'll briefly just note that the targeting pod has a laser pointer. We can fire it manually with our nose wheel steering button when we're in the air. Seems a little weird, but multifunction displays. Whoops, ignore that. Our multifunctions, multifunction buttons, so to speak. The nose wheel steering button gets repurposed as the laser firing button. And you can see the little L here means our laser is armed. I've lost the point track right now, so I can't laze it. But just know that with the nose wheel steering button, we can laze that target. A few other functions here. I'm going to click on this button called Control. And we have some options we can change here. Laser latching on and off. We can change metric to US and off. We can change our laser code. More on laser codes when we explore laser guided bombs, but know that the laser has an identifier code so that it can be picked up. Friendly symbology: if we have targets on the ground that are known friendlies, they'll come up as X's, so we don't accidentally, lock them up and drop a bomb on them. Most of this other stuff you're not necessarily need to worry about. It's got some testing modes. Let's briefly talk about air-to-air mode. It's not something you're going to use that much. However, I'll point it out. So, whoa, that's bright. Soy, boat switch, CCD. So the targeting pod has an air-to-air mode. A few key differences with the air-to-air mode is that we don't get a targeting diamond on the HUD here. We are still able to slew the targeting pod around, as you can see, but primarily the targeting pod is going to look up for the most part, and it's going to have an easier time getting a point track on other aircraft. This is useful for a couple of things. Let's say you wanted to visually identify an intruding aircraft into your airspace, or you're flying around and an enemy helicopter comes in and you want to identify him. That's sort of what you would use for it. Using the point track modes in the air-to-air mode doesn't pass anything with regards to weapons data. So it's not something you're going to use that much, but just be aware that it does exist, and it does have some uses based on what mission profile you're trying to do, such as if you need to identify enemy helicopters or enemy airplanes close up, that sort of thing. You'll primarily, and I'm going to say 99.9% of the time, be using this pod in air-to-ground mode. Alright, that's the basics of the Lightning targeting pod in the A-10C. Hope you enjoyed that, and we'll see you for next video, where we will talk about likely countermeasures, and then we'll move on to weapons. So we're almost there, guys. We're going to get ready to start dropping bombs soon. But until then, hope you enjoy and take care.